Joining me today is New Hampshire State Senator Jerry Little. Jerry, in the last segment, we were sort of talking about that process to be commissioner, and sort of we were going over the sort of the political component of it, the letters that were written in, people who didn't know you. And I cut you off because we had to go to break, and I want to give you a chance to sort of finish your thought.
I think I was pretty much there. I think the bottom line is that I feel that I perform honestly and admirably for the people of the state of New Hampshire. It's the way that I, as a former town moderator, for a number of roles that I've done in my local community, and now as a state senator, I take my constituents and their concerns and my oath seriously and perform to it. And I'm confident that people will see, once I've got a year or two underneath my belt as bank commissioner, that I'm doing the same thing in that role.
In the hearing in front of the Executive Council, you talked about the need for sort of balancing the regulatory environment for small banks. I want to spend maybe 30 seconds on this. What's the issue that small banks are facing?
Yeah, small banks and credit unions are all facing an enormous avalanche of regulation coming from the federal level. It's really difficult for them to be able to contribute the amount of time, money, and resources to simple compliance, which is only an expense. There's no way to generate revenue off of compliance. That is difficult for them to deal with. And I think the real problem is that out of Washington we get a one-size-fits-all solution to every problem. There are certainly issues there and problems that it's appropriate for Congress and federal regulators to address, but the solutions always are ones that it's easy for large financial institutions to deal with because they have great numbers of lawyers and compliance officers that do nothing but deal with it all day long. Many more compliance officers than most community credit unions and banks have total employee base. But the small institutions are still required to comply with it. So, I think that it would be best if Washington would look at bifurcating the regulatory system so that there is one set of rules and requirements for very large institutions and a separate set for small community-based institutions.
And would that help the the average consumer in New Hampshire?
I think it would. There's truly a symbiotic relationship, in my opinion, between small community credit unions and banks and their communities. And their customers. And I know large financial institutions are doing a much better job these days of creating that relationship base with individuals across the country. But still, the local credit union CEO, bank CEO, senior officers are the ones that are sitting on the school board and the Rotary clubs in our communities, and they see the community problems. And so I think we need to give them, I would love to see Washington, because this is nothing really that I think we can do much about at the state level, in any state. I would love to see them give them some breathing room so that they can focus more on those community needs.
Okay, and I promised I'd turn to some other issues beside this. I want to talk a little bit about your reflections on your role as a senator the last 2 years. What was the hardest vote you had to take?
I think the hardest vote I had to take was probably my first vote on whether or not people had to live in the state of New Hampshire for 30 days before they'd be eligible to vote. I understand that there's a great deal of concern about voter fraud in the state of New Hampshire. I've supported the 30-day residency requirement the first time the bill came through. The governor vetoed it, and that gave me a second shot. And then I did not vote to override the veto because I felt that that was the right vote. I struggled with that vote mightily for days before it came up, to the second before I had to cast my vote. I was still unsure because in my head I felt it was wrong. My heart was telling me that voter fraud it's bad for democracy and we need to do something about it. I made a mistake, and because of the veto I had an opportunity to correct it. And, you know, I promised myself that every vote that I took would not keep me awake at night, that I would struggle with everything up to the vote, but once I cast my vote, that I wouldn't lose any sleep, that I wouldn't struggle with it, that I'd be proud of every vote I took. That's the only one that I went home and said, I made a mistake. That was wrong. So I was glad to have a chance to fix it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And we're out of time, but before I go, sometime after June 2nd, I'd love to get you back talking, forward-thinking about the banking, your role as a banking commissioner.
I'd look forward to that. Thank you.
Well, great. Jerry, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Capital Connections, your weekly access to politics and policy along the I-89 and I-91 corridors and how it impacts your life in our region. If you've got a comment or an idea for a future show, please send me an email. And stay tuned at the same time next week for another edition of Capital Connections.